What we talk about when we talk about history of philosophy? What is falsafa or Arabic philosophy? What is the role of history in understanding philosophy? And what do we mean by historical research? These and some others are questions that I will discuss with my guest in this interview. My guest is Professor Peter Adamson. He does not need an introduction, for he is perhaps the most famous and active historian of philosophy. Peter Adamson is a full professor of late ancient and Arabic philosophy at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich and one of the directors of Munich School of Ancient Philosophy. Previously, he has been the professor of ancient and medieval philosophy at King's College London. He introduces himself as a full-time historian of philosophy and is the host of the widely known History of Philosophy podcast. His long list of publications includes several books and dozens of articles on philosophical topics throughout the history of philosophy, from ancient Greek to Arabic to medieval philosophy. Besides the history of philosophy, he is specifically interested in Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions and currents. He is the author of the book series History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which are revised book versions of his aforementioned podcast. Check the link in the description if you are interested to see a full list of Peter Adamson's publications, as well as the link to his fascinating podcast. Hello, Peter. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Hi, Hanif. It's a great pleasure to be here. Looking forward to talking to you about this.
Thank you very much. Peter, as you know, in a much-read article, Richard Rorty writes, analytic philosophers who have attempted rational reconstruction of the arguments of great dead philosophers have done so in the hope of treating these philosophers as contemporaries, as colleagues with whom they can exchange views. They have argued that unless one does this, one might as well turn over the history of philosophy to historians, whom they picture as mere doxographers, rather than seekers after philosophical truth. Such reconstructions, however, have led to charges of anachronism. Analytic historians of philosophy are frequently accused of beating texts into the shape of propositions currently being debated in the philosophical journals. In light of the efforts of the historiographers of philosophy during the last decades, however, it appears to remain little basis for today's historians of philosophy, or rather, contextually oriented philosophers, to consider themselves solitary, nor should they regret a lack of appreciation from ahistorical colleagues. For much good work has been done lately in this field, that the significance of historical philosophical reading of great minds of the past has become more manifest, such that questions such as what is the role of history of philosophy in philosophizing may sound trivial or just unnecessary. Yet, for the audience of this video blog, it might be still interesting to know what's the opinion of one of the leading historians of philosophy in this regard. So let me to start our interview with posing the old question anew. Why have you studied and are you still studying the history of philosophy? Why history of philosophy and not philosophy itself? Why not contemporary philosophy? What is the contribution of history in philosophizing with Aristotle or Avicenna?
Okay, well, that's obviously a very big topic. And I think that in the quotation from Rorty that you read out, and also maybe in the way that you set up the question, there's a kind of hidden assumption, which is that what defines philosophy is what people think philosophy is right now. So there's this field we call philosophy, just as there's a field called physics or chemistry. And just as physics is like the cutting edge, currently achieved standard theory in physics, or theories in physics, or in chemistry, so there would be a kind of body of philosophical work, doctrines, ideas, whatever. And that's what today's philosophers are doing. And that defines what philosophy is. And therefore, historians of philosophy have to both justify what they do and define what they do relative to that, the way that a historian of physics might define what he or she does relative to contemporary physics. And that's not really how I see it. I think that discussions of this question by historians of philosophy are often starting from a kind of unduly defensive position, because they concede that point at the beginning. They say, well, if what you're interested in is philosophical truth, then of course you should be doing contemporary philosophy, right? So you might even think that's the same thing as original philosophy, right? Because it's being done now by you, so it's original contemporary philosophy, right? But of course, there's an easy slide from that to talking about doing, roughly speaking, something like analytic philosophy in English in the early 21st century, because that's really what people mean when they say contemporary philosophy. I think about it quite differently. And part of the reason that I think about it differently is, I guess, just kind of biographical. So not only, as you said before, not only have I worked on Greek philosophy and philosophy in the Islamic world, also medieval philosophy, but through my podcast, I've done quite a lot of stuff on classical Indian philosophy, Africana philosophy, started to think about Chinese philosophy for a future series that we're doing on that. And so I've come to think of philosophy as a discipline, as being something that does involve and include contemporary philosophy, or if you want to say maybe contemporary analytic philosophy in English to make it more specific. It certainly includes that. And I think that's very interesting. I'm very interested in contemporary analytic philosophy in English. I think it's cool. I enjoy going to talks on it and so on. But to me, that's just a very small part of philosophy and what it is. To me, philosophy as a subject is more like art. So just as art is all the art that's ever been created by anybody anywhere, so philosophy is all the philosophy that's been created by anybody anywhere. And I don't really see why we should give a certain kind of contemporary philosophy some kind of privileged status in defining why it might be worthwhile or not worthwhile to study the history of philosophy. And one way to see this point actually might be to forget history of philosophy for a second and just think about what it means to talk about contemporary philosophy. So as I said, people often use that as shorthand for something like analytic philosophy in English. But of course, there are different styles and approaches to philosophy, even within the English-speaking world, certainly within Europe, to say nothing of, let's say, contemporary philosophy in Iran, which we'll talk about later, which is very different, or in Thailand or Africa or wherever, right? So I think there's a kind of subtle but pernicious cultural imperialism going on here, where one group of people has sort of taken the right for themselves to decide what philosophy is, and then demanded that any other enterprise that dares to use the word philosophy to describe what it's doing should somehow show that it's useful relative to this project. I think that there's obviously good pragmatic reasons why a historian of philosophy might want to be able to do that. So for example, if you're doing, let's say, history of philosophy in, I don't know, in India in the 14th century CE, then if you want to get a job in a Western university, you probably do have to have a pretty good story about how what you're doing might relate to something that contemporary analytic philosophers are doing. But I really think that's the main reason why historians of philosophy should be able to do it. They should be able to do it in order to get funding, to get jobs, to have interesting discussions with their colleagues. But I don't actually think that makes what they're doing more legitimate. So I think a historian of philosophy who's working on a topic, text, or figure that is completely irrelevant to contemporary analytic philosophers is no worse off with respect to the question of what they're doing is whether what they're doing is philosophy. They're no worse off than, let's say, contemporary analytic philosophers are, because what they're doing is irrelevant to the interests and concerns to of let's say a 4th century CE Platonist. Like Plotinus wouldn't think that contemporary analytic philosophy is interesting, probably, but that doesn't mean that contemporary analytic philosophy isn't philosophy.
Yeah, of course. And actually, that's quite a radical case, right? Because, I mean, most people might want to like justify their like occupation as the historian of philosophy by showing the parallels between like contemporary philosophy and like ancient or medieval theories, like pointing at people who were kind of influenced by those figures, or even as we have seen recently, by showing that some highly influential, towering figures in contemporary philosophy were actually plagiarizing some ancient or medieval sources, like the case with Frede and Stoic logic, which was shown very good by Susan Babson. But your view is very actually radical, more radical than that. And actually, I like it much more because it's kind of is ready to credit the historians of philosophy for doing research after philosophical truths, which is very great. But since Rorty has also mentioned the doxographers, I was wondering, how do you distinguish doxographers from historians of philosophy? Or is there any significant distinction between them?
Yeah, so I think here's where we get to a question that I think is more difficult and more worth asking, because the way the question is usually posed is, okay, you historians of philosophy, tell us what you're going to do for us philosophers, right? And what I'm saying is, well, who are you to say that historians of philosophy aren't philosophers, right? And who are you to say that like Nagarjuna, a 2nd century CE skeptical Buddhist, why isn't he just as good a philosopher as, you know, the latest articles being published in journals on analytic philosophy? So I think that I have a kind of democratic view of what counts as philosophy, namely all the philosophy that's been done everywhere at all times, right? Now, the more difficult question becomes, well, hang on a second. Nagarjuna or Plato or Aquinas or Avicenna, right? These are thinkers who were not involved in some kind of antiquarian or historical enterprise. They were coming up with philosophy of their own, right? So I think this would be the more useful contrast. So maybe the contrast should be something like history of philosophy and original philosophy. So philosophy that sort of concerns itself with looking back at what other philosophers have done, as opposed to people who are sort of putting forth views and arguments of their own, right? Here, by the way, again, we should bear in mind that there is the phenomenon of like philosophy in various cultures right now. So, for example, if I'm studying philosophy that's being done in Iran right now, that doesn't really count as history of philosophy, but it would fall on the non-original side of this contrast that I'm drawing between original and non-original. So non-original would be like looking at what other philosophers have done and saying something about it, okay? And I guess at the limit case, that's something you could describe as mere doxography. So all I'm doing is telling you what Plato said. There's this famous book, right, about Plato called What Plato Said, which sort of almost advertises its doxographical nature. So at the one end of the spectrum, you might have, let's say, a philosophy book or article which doesn't mention any other philosopher and just seems to have been written in a kind of pure space of reason. And at the other end, you have extremely historical work, which is content merely to kind of tell you what other people said and perhaps why they said it. Okay. So I think that contrast makes sense. But to me, those would be more like 2 ends of a continuum. So let's start with the supposedly highly original or purely original kind of philosophy. Well, in fact, like even if you think about what analytic philosophers do who have no historical interests at all and never read anything that's not in English and don't know what's going on in any non-English speaking countries, right? So the sort of most original kind of philosopher, who notice is also apparently the most ignorant kind of philosopher, right? So it's someone who doesn't pay attention to anything other than what they're thinking about themselves, which maybe, maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe being ignorant in that way. I mean, ignorant, of course, is a pejorative term, but it actually might be kind of liberating, right? So you don't have anything kind of blurring your view. So you can just see the truth, right?
It allows you to concentrate on the
It allows you to concentrate, exactly. Whereas people like me are kind of confused by all this Aristotle and Messina and so on that they're reading. Okay, but in fact, that's not what they do, right? They don't literally never buy any books, shut themselves up in their study and just think, right? What they do is they usually respond to the last things that have been published in their field, right? The more original ones may seem to be departing from the field in a bolder way, but even those people are almost always responding to what's been going on in whatever they take the philosophical field to be. Again, very much in the way that very original artists are usually responding to what's been going on in art up to them, up to their time, right? So actually this idea of like pure original philosophy, which doesn't respond in any way to previous philosophy or contemporaneous philosophy other than what this one philosopher wants to say, that almost doesn't exist, I think. I mean, that would almost be like the equivalent of outsider art, like these people in, asylums for people with psychological problems who seem to be creating art that has no context. So that's something people talk about in art history sometimes. There isn't really any outsider philosophy, right? So that's one end of the continuum. The other end of the continuum is, let's say, the pure doxographer. So notice that when I was describing that, I said, well, this is someone who will only tell you what these other philosophers said or are saying and why they said it. But hang on a second. As soon as we get into why they said it, we're getting into reconstruction of some kind of philosophical rationale. You're trying to explain why it made sense for them to say this. You're probably also thinking of possible objections, how they could answer them, right? And so very quickly we see that history of philosophy, even when it's extremely doxographical, because it's quite close to that end of the spectrum, actually involves a lot of creative philosophical work. And in fact, I think that what's really going on is that everyone is closer to the middle than is often assumed, because I think people often think, well, a philosophy department is going to be made of some historians and they're at one end, and some analytic philosophers, let's say, on the other end. So there's the people who are doing ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics, they're over here. And there's the people who are doing ancient and early modern philosophy, and they're over here. But actually, that's not what's going on. They're talking to each other, right? So the so-called contemporary philosophers are responding to what the other contemporary philosophers are doing, and ultimately to a long tradition that goes way, way, way back into history. And they may know more or less about that, but it's all relevant to what they're doing. While the historians of philosophy are trying to provide compelling reconstructions, at least, of historical philosophical positions, which involves a lot of philosophizing, right? And so at this point, I think that one almost starts to lose one's grip on what the difference would be between the so-called contemporary philosopher and the so-called historian of philosophy, because the so-called contemporary philosopher is someone who's responding to a lot of other philosophers who may be closer or more distant in time and geography, while the historian of philosophy is someone who's doing a lot of philosophical work, which looks original and creative. And that might mean that what we're left with in the end is a question of motivation, where the historian of philosophy really just wants to understand what somebody else thought and why, whereas the contemporary philosopher, the original philosopher, is someone who, as it were, wants to understand what they think and why, or they want to put forward a view and argue for it, right? But then, to be honest, I start to sort of not so clear to me why that would be an interesting difference, because either way, you're putting forth some philosophical views and explaining the rationale for them. And then it just seems to be a kind of biographical question, like, who had that idea? Is it the person who's writing the book? Or is it the person who wrote the book that the historian is studying? But either way, you've got a whole bunch of philosophical doctrines and rationales for those doctrines, which can be considered by someone else. So I actually like stepping back from everything I've just said, I think that the whole debate is problematic in two ways. One is, and the more obvious way, is that it sort of assumes this privileged status to contemporary philosophy that's done in English. But the other way that is problematic is that it simply concedes the idea that there are two very different phenomena here, namely doing philosophy and studying history of philosophy. And actually, there's a lot of history of philosophy in doing philosophy, and there's a lot of philosophy in history of philosophy. And in fact, everyone's kind of in this jumbled place in the middle. I would still say that, like, I'm clearly more on the so-called historical end than, you know, someone who's, let's say, a philosopher of mind in an analytic philosophy department. But we're just in different places on that spectrum. We're not doing fundamentally different kinds of things, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very detailed answer. So I hope that our audience have been convinced that, like, the historical approach is important and productive. I mean, I wasn't sure that they really need an argument, or that was a quite convincing argument. So now I want to get to the question of the methodology of historical research. So in my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, doing contextually and historically oriented research on philosophy should entail at least three elements. So which would be the historical philology, studying cultural and historical context, and philosophical competence. And these three elements should kind of determine each other mutually. So the historical philology or philology would help us with like reading the text, of course, dealing directly with the text, determining their, like, authenticity and the intertextual interrelations. The historical context, studying the history or historical context, would help us with determining like the opponents of the philosophers, the proponents, to whom they are talking, and things like that. And also the philosophical, at the end, the philosophical competence would help us to make sense of the arguments which are now philologically and historically determined. Like, we know the borders, we know, like, the terminology, we know that, for example, this philosopher could not have meant, like, A with the word B, for example, things like that. But of course, this is, if this like explanation is sound, then it is only in theory sound. So knowing something in theory is kind of different from putting it in praxis. So, and I know that every scholar has its own, like, mode of operation. So I was wondering, how would you do your research when you are, for example, when you decide to write something on Avicenna or Aristotle or Aquinas? So what is your personal strategy?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. I really like the way you set it up. I mean, I think the first thing to say here is that there's different ways of writing about the history of philosophy. And I probably have to think about that more than most people, because I do, as it were, proper research that gets published in journals and as books and so on. But I also write these podcasts, right? And so the difference is that the podcasts are not really research. They're more like synopses or summaries of research by other people, okay? And I do try to delve pretty deeply into the secondary literature on the things I'm covering, I mean, within time constraints, but I'm not usually trying to say something new that would stand up to scrutiny by other scholars in the field. I guess maybe occasionally I do, because I just think, oh, here's an interesting idea, and I kind of include it. But even when I do that, I don't try to substantiate it or argue for it at the same length as I would in my normal research, okay? So I think there's actually, again, there's a kind of continuum there, like at the one end, extremely superficial summaries of what was going on in a particular figure or text, right? And at the other end, cutting edge research. And again, you can sort of be anywhere you want along that continuum. But let's just talk about the cutting edge research end. since that's really, I think, what you're asking about. And here, I think you and I are both quite conscious of this multifaceted collection of skills that you might want to have, because you and I both work on medieval Islamic philosophy. And the same point would go for like ancient Greek philosophy or medieval Latin philosophy, or for that matter, classical Chinese or Indian philosophy. So these are fields where the texts are in quite difficult, it's kind of in quite a difficult state. So we're talking about works that were originally written down by hand in manuscripts. They've been passed down to us through copies that may have mistakes. And so the philological aspect is extremely important. And the problems are potentially very acute. Like maybe we don't even know what the person wrote. So for example, Aristotle, right? So a colleague of ours here in Munich, Oliver Primavesi, spends his time re-editing works of Aristotle that have already been edited in order to get a better text that gets us a little bit closer to what Aristotle actually wrote. So literally the letters on the page are still a moving target. And the same thing would be true of Zeno or any medieval thinker, right? Because it's all very long ago. The texts have reached us through a more or less difficult path. Whereas if you were doing a history of philosophy on, let's say, G.E. Moore or Bertrand Russell, okay, you might be able to like find notebooks with manuscript copies and stuff, but for the most part, you know, you could probably just get away with reading the published text, right? And I think that's there's a gradual evolution, like where the ultimate difficult situation would be like the pre-Socratics, and the easiest situation would be I'm trying to understand the thought of someone who published a book last year, right, and wrote it on a computer, and I know they were happy with the way it was printed, right? So I think the relevance of philology depends on what area or period really and culture of philosophy you're working on. But for anything other than very, very recent stuff, it's certainly an issue. So like Locke or Hume scholars would still have to worry about this quite a lot, right? Then there's this question about how much do you need to know about the historical circumstances? Like how much do you need to know about the Persian War or the wars between Athens and Sparta in order to understand Plato? Or how much do you need to know about, you know, the Safavid Empire to understand Mulla Sadra, right? Then the third thing is the philosophical analysis part, right? Where you're good at like analyzing arguments, disambiguating ambiguities, making like coming up with potential counterexamples, that kind of thing. So the kind of skill that you actually learn by studying contemporary philosophy, as it were. And so your question really is, well, how do those three things kind of engage with each other? And basically my answer is that the perfect historian of philosophy would be maximally good at all three. And so actually, I don't think there's a kind of right answer here. I think that someone who's very, very good at one of those two things and is completely rubbish at the other two can do good work. But the best work would be done by someone who's good at all three and has all of that skill and knowledge in their head. Now, obviously, that's kind of an ideal to shoot for because, for example, I'm not nearly as good a philologist as Oliver Primavesi, and I'm not nearly as good a philosopher as, I don't know, Michael Freda, right? And I don't know as much about history as like Anthony Grafton does, right? Just to take some examples, right? Or I'm trying to think of like colleagues that I've had. So for example, Verity Hart, who's someone I worked with for years at King's College London. She's definitely a better philosopher than I am. She's just much, much more like, she has this sort of light in her that she can see ideas better than I can. And I've worked with people who are better historians than me and better philologians than me. So I think that I'm probably someone who's trying to at least get pretty far in all three areas and not concentrate on one to the expense of the other two. I think of those three, I would probably say the thing that I'm better at is the philosophy part. But I try to be on top of the historical context and the philological situation as well. So I think that there's actually just a kind of choice one can make here. Like, do you want to really accentuate one of those three things, or do you want to try to combine the three? But in addition to that, and in fact, I think this is in a way the right answer, is that you have to really be aware of your own strengths and limitations and make up for it by collaborating. So especially since I've come to Munich, where in Germany, we have a very kind of collaborative culture where you have like teams of academics. And I've really tried to build a group of people here who work on ancient philosophy and philosophy in the Islamic world, where we have a range of people who are more or less in the philology part, the philosophy part, the historical part. And I think one of the things that's really great about our group is that we have that combination. And so if I like don't know what's going on with the plausibility of a certain reading in a manuscript, I can ask one of the people who are better at text stuff. If I need to talk over a problem in metaphysics, I can ask someone who's good at that. And I think that's a really good answer to the question. The good answer is to try to be good at all three, know how good you are at all three, and make up for your shortcomings by talking to other people who are even better at it than you are.
So thank you very much. That was very illuminating. But one even more specific question: what is your very personal? Do you have a very personal like mode of operation? Like you want to write on, let's say, problem of evil in, let's say, Avicenna.
Mm-hmm.
How would you start your work? How would you proceed? Do you first, for example, try to read the secondary literature, then start writing, or you first write what you want to write?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Provided like a very preliminary draft, and then look into the secondary literature, then try to make a case for your argument. Is there?
Yeah, I think actually what I'm at the early stages of a research project, what I'm looking for is not something that I want to prove. It's usually something more like a problem or a puzzle. So most of my sort of journal length articles have come out of a process where I was reading a text for whatever reason, like maybe to teach it, for example. And I come across something where I think, well, that's weird. Why does this person say that? Right. And then, and I think even when it doesn't literally come from a moment where I was puzzled by something in the text, what I'm always looking for is a problem. And there's something I say to students a lot, actually. In fact, I'm sure I've said it to you while you were writing your PhD, right? So my slogan here is the question is always, what is the question? So you don't start off with a theme like evil in Avicenna. You start off with a question, like, given that Avicenna has a privative theory of evil, where he thinks that evil is non-being, how can he explain illness as a kind of evil? So I've never written a paper on that, but you can see there's a paper there to be written, right? You could go look at his medical works, look at what he says about evil, and then go from there, right? So you're really looking for a question where the question is answerable and the answer is not obvious. And here's also maybe where the philosophy comes in. This is something that Christoph Rapp once said to me, that it's not enough to just, I think one thing that makes the process not mere doxography is that you're looking for questions that are interesting. And what interesting means, as I said before, doesn't need to be defined by the interests of contemporary philosophers, the so-called contemporary philosophers, but it needs to somehow like cry out to the person who's doing the work as being interesting in some way, right? So if it seems trivial or the answer is obvious, as I said, then it's not a good question. Once you've got the good question, you're basically ready to really start. And then I would say that I probably focus more on primary text reading than secondary text reading, but that's in part because of the area of the history of philosophy that I do, where there's not as much secondary literature. Whereas if it was Aristotle, as soon as you've got your question, well, okay, now you've got to go off and consult the 750 articles and 123 books that have been devoted to this issue and figure out what there is still left to say. That's less of a problem in Neoplatonism, and it's much less of a problem in philosophy in the Islamic world. But thanks. I mean, I guess usually when I'm consulting secondary literature for my own research projects, I'm looking for points that might be helpful that I might want to like draw on. But a lot of what I'm doing is just check what people have already done so that I don't do it again, because that would be a waste of time.
Right, right. Thank you very much. So I want kind of to shift from more theoretical issues to some less theoretical. I want to be focused on the falsafa, or philosophy in the Islamic world, which is the term which you use in your scholarship for describing falsafa in English, and it is actually quite close to the terms which were used by pre-contemporary, let's say, if it's correct, pre-contemporary philosophers in that tradition. But namely, I mean, they describe their occupation always as philosophy, unqualifiedly, without any further linguistic, historical, or religious qualification. Terms such as Arabic philosophy, Islamic philosophy, Iranian Islamic philosophy, Turkish Islamic philosophy, these are somehow modern terms and have been coined for non-philosophical purposes. But one of the things that comes to mind always when we deal with an issue is, of course, the question of denomination. The other question is the question of delimitation or definition. So I don't want you to talk about the question of the name, title, or denomination, but how do you define or delimit this tradition, the falsafa?
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a problem here, which is that the word falsafa has come to be used in modern Arabic and also Persian as just a translation of the English word philosophy, so to speak, right? So there are philosophy departments also in Turkish, right? And they're called felsefe, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't signal that they think they're doing exactly what people were doing in the 10th century CE when they did falsafa. So there's actually a lot of room for confusion here, because we have the Greek word philosophia and all of its modern cognates. And then I would just say that the Persian, Turkish, Arabic word falsafa is one of those cognates, okay? And it just means the same thing as philosophie in French or German, or philosophy in English. But then there's this much more culturally specific thing, which is falsafa as a tradition that emerged out of the Greek Arabic translation movement in the 8th, 9th century CE. And so in that context, when I use the word falsafa, I think actually this is something that Frank Griffel has pointed out. It would be fair to say that philosophy is not a good translation of the word falsafa, because philosophy implies some very broad thing that would include everything in the culture that was in any way philosophical, right? Whereas falsafa really meant engaging with Aristotle, or if not Aristotle, then Aristotle plus other works of Greek philosophy that had been translated into Arabic, but it's mostly Aristotle, right? So that's what it means at first. So it means Aristotelian philosophy with some drawing on Neoplatonism. It might also include the study of some of the Greek sciences, right? But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a tradition that was really distinctive in the fact that it was engaging with a foreign body of literature. And I think that at that time, in the 10th century, let's say, an Arabic speaker who heard the word falsafa would still kind of hear it as a foreign loan word, which we don't, right? So when we hear the word philosophy in English, or I guess in modern day Persian, you don't hear the Greek origin of it anymore, right? It's just the word philosophy. So that changes then when Ibn Sina comes along. So Avicenna is how he's often called in English, but let's call him by his real name, Ibn Sina. So Ibn Sina, it has such a huge impact that after him, falsafa starts being used as a word for what he did. And kind of whoever agrees with him is a philosoph, right? So the falasifa, and you can see this very clearly, the obvious example is in Ghazali, because he writes this work in coherence of the philosophers, the falasifa, and he means Avicenna and anyone who agrees with him, right? And I think that persists for quite a while. It's a sort of open historical question how long that persists. And when does falsafa really start kind of modulating into a much more general term? And I don't know the answer to that question. You probably know better than I would, actually. But I kind of guess that falsafa stops meaning Avicennan / Aristotelian philosophy and starts meaning just philosophy, kind of through renewed contact with European culture, actually. One reason why, and you might, by the way, viewers might be wondering, well, how could this be? Like, don't they need a word for philosophy in general, like any kind of reflection on philosophical questions? And the answer is yes, and they've got it, and it's hikmah, which means wisdom, right? So you have like this interesting phenomenon in, let's say, the 12th or the 13th century, which is a period we've been studying a lot in Munich, including with you, where we've been seeing the word falsafa used in a much narrower way than the word hikmah, because the word hikmah is basically like, oh, we're doing metaphysics and epistemology and ethics, right? Whereas falsafa means Avicennism, okay? So I think that there's, so the weird thing about this word is that it's kind of gone through 3 stages. First, it was philosophy being done in the style of the Greeks and as an engagement with Aristotle and other Greeks. Then it starts to mean the same thing, but with Ibn Sina instead of Aristotle. And then eventually it starts to just mean philosophy. And it's very important not to get confused about that.
Right. Yeah, that was very good. So you would say that you wouldn't necessarily delimit falsafa in terms of time. So if now we have a certain person who's an Avicenna scholar and does his job in the like quite traditional way, he also belongs to this tradition of falsafa. But whereas,
yeah, I mean, I guess that the way the word is used has changed over time, but they also might have overlapped, right? So you could imagine someone nowadays saying, well, I'm interested in falsafa, and what they're thinking is Avicenna philosophy, even though contemporaneously there's some people who say, well, I'm in the philosophy department and I study Quine, right? So those two things could coexist.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that was very nice. So that this may bring me to another question, a more contemporary question, and it regards the situation of the falsafa. So in contemporary Iran, actually the living tradition of philosophy or falsafa in Iran considers itself quite correctly as the heir or inheritor of the scientific, philosophical, theological currents that are more than a millennium old and have begun to flourish from around the time of the Greco-Arabic translation movement. So it considers itself as a natural continuation, natural and rightful continuation of the mainstream of philosophy, which began according to the classic Muslim philosophers from Greek philosophy. But yet this historical understanding does not give rise to a historical understanding of its positions and concepts. So the falsafa remained always interested in the latest version of the arguments, latest version of the concepts, and fond of lively reconstructions of the arguments. So quite similar to Rorty's description of analytic philosophy of the time. Yet in the contemporary time, so Persian-speaking scholars showed a certain degree of interest in historiographies of falsafa written in modern European academia, or let's say in modern languages, because they showed some interest also in the pre-modern time. But its interest was soon dashed because of their bad experience with that kind of scholarship of the time, actually 15 maybe 5 decades ago. So one of the grave misgivings of the scholarship, this European scholarship, was the myth of the death of falsafa after Averroes's or Ibn Rushd's response to Ghazali's criticism of falsafa or of Avicennan philosophy, which was, as you know, invented by Ernst Röhm at the end of the 19th century. This myth was repeated in several books on the history of falsafa or global histories of philosophy until some decades ago. But nowadays, thanks to the works which was done by historiographers of philosophy, we know that it was wrong. It is more used as an anecdote at the beginning of funny anecdote actually at the beginning of the books, like for so indicating like who we are, who are doing like history of falsafa and what do we do. So even though, so the reactions against Renan's hypothesis, as you know, actually were, so emerged during Renan's own life. Like the first one was, I guess, Sayyid Jamaluddin Asadabadi. And then European historiographers started to criticize him. But since like the progress or the development of the knowledge is cumulative, also the critics should have added step by step, one by one to each other, so that you can eventually like reject Renan's hypothesis. But this hypothesis had a very like negative impact on the imagination of people outside Europe, especially in different corners of the Islamic world, of the European scholarship on history of philosophy. So many of them might still think that the European philosophy has been dead after Averroes. So I was wondering what is like the dominating or the dominant grand narrative of the fate of falsafa in contemporary European academia.
Yeah,
Can
that's
you
a
please...
difficult question to answer. I think I'm less optimistic than you are about the current situation, because I think that if you asked most people who have kind of a general literacy about the history of philosophy, let's say in history department, in philosophy departments, I think a lot of them probably still are working under the assumption that philosophy in the Islamic world just ends with Averroes. And they would call him Averroes, right? Not Ibn Rushd, because they're seeing it from a Latin medieval point of view, which is the problem, right? So also think about the fact that nowadays, I think a lot more you're finding that courses on medieval philosophy taught by non-Arabists would include texts by Avicenna and Averroes and Farabi and Kindi, right? It's a lot easier now than it was even, say, 25 years ago, because there's many more translations, there's a lot more secondary literature to draw on. But you wouldn't find them teaching Fakhreddin Razi or even Mullah Sadra, who's been possible to teach for a long, long time, right? In English, I mean. So I actually think that that kind of death of philosophy in the Islamic world around 1200, that old narrative, the Haynan's narrative, is not as dead as you think it is, or as you were just describing. I mean, I share your optimism when it comes to the field of specialists. So I think in the field of specialists, hardly anyone would say that. Or if they believed it, they wouldn't dare to say it out loud because they'd immediately kind of get shouted down, right? There is a big debate about what is the nature and status of philosophy, let's say after, I don't know, 1100 or something, in the Islamic East especially. But I think everyone kind of now understands, okay, there's something there to be studied and we need to come to grips with it. You know, you and I are both people who have been doing that, and there's a lot of other people. We were not the first to think of it. We're kind of coming, I mean, I think of myself as having come into that story pretty late, because a lot of other people were already doing it before me, like Rob Wisnowski, Hadran Eichner, you know. And there's still a lot of people who are focusing on earlier sort of classical stuff, who are happy to concede that there's post-classical philosophy as well, but they want to keep working on Farabi and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, which is fine, obviously. So I think probably the situation is that actually, like insofar as there's a general understanding of the situation, it's probably pretty much like it was before, unfortunately, but at least someone who looks into it a little bit and maybe finds my podcast or something, or, you know, introductory books on the topic that were written recently would see that being challenged. Like, as you say, often the very first page would say, well, we used to think this, but now we think something else, right? And so that makes me optimistic that will less and less be an assumption that you find sort of in the philosophy world more broadly. But if we talk about like what does the field of experts think is the narrative, I don't think that we've decided yet, actually. So I think that's going to be one of the most exciting things that will happen maybe between like now and the end of my career in about 20 years is, you know, maybe the field settling on some kind of consensus of the shape of post-classical philosophy and how we get sort of from the time of, let's say, Sohrawardi and Fakhreddin Razi to the time of the three great Muslim empires, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, and how we get from there to modern Islamic philosophy. If we could like sort of stitch together a narrative that gets us all the way from, you know, 1200 or so up to the 21st century, then that would be a huge achievement. But I don't think we're there yet. So it's not the same as the situation in European philosophy, where people could kind of give you a story about how we got from medieval philosophy to analytic philosophy. I don't think that that really exists, at least in European language scholarship. It doesn't exist.
Thanks. Actually, so my questions are becoming less and less theoretical. So now I come to a more practical question, which is kind of related to the previous question. So we hope that the scientific research, if done in a systematic way, will lead to the advancement of or pushing forward of the frontiers of knowledge, and we hope that how we do science step by step helps us understanding the situation better and better, and this demands a kind of collaboration between different scholars of each field. And so certainly the Iranian and Arab and Turkish academia working on falsafa are parts of this constellation of international or global academia. So in Europe, when you work in Europe and you write, for example, something on Avicenna, so almost every expert reader would expect you to have covered secondary literature written in Italian, French, sometimes even, and of course, depending on the reviewer, the referee, and things like that, Spanish, so literature written on Avicenna. But no one would expect you to cover the secondary literature written in Arabic and Persian, even though these are the primary languages of the research. So it is fine if I write something on Avicenna and don't consider any secondary literature written in Persian, even the analytic introductions of the books. But it's not fine if I disregard the Italian scholarship on Avicenna. Some of us are, of course, are let's say, humble and honest enough to say that our linguistic capacity is maybe insufficient for cover such a huge body of literature written in Persian and Arabic. Of course, we can dedicate our time reading primary literature in Persian and Arabic, but reading that amount of thing in those languages is not economically beneficial for us. But this has kind of negative aspects, just as of course, some of these scholars also might look at the scholarship written in Persian and Arabic arrogantly from a high point and disregard all of them altogether for not being written in according to the academic standards of us in Europe. But this has kind of a negative impact on the other party, because they would also say they are neglecting us, so why are we caring at all about their scholarship? In the end, what we have experienced from their scholarship, and in most of the cases they are referring to the books which have been translated before or which they have read when, for example, they were graduate or undergraduate students, they were philosophically inadequate. And so inadequate and insufficient. So that's kind of the situation that I observe. And I was wondering whether you see a problem here. Do you think there is a problem at all? And if there is a problem, how can we kind of overcome this conflict?
Yeah.
Of course, the European scholar might say, I'm very much interested to read good secondary literature. Of course, just as not anything written in English is worthwhile for being read as secondary literature, of course, not everything which is written in Persian and Arabic is worthwhile for reading as secondary literature. And I don't know how to start, where to start.
Yeah, I think that's probably that certainly describes my situation for most of my career. Everything you said there. So like the difficulty of coping with that body of literature when you're not a native speaker. So if you read Arabic and Persian slowly, you know, if you're going to spend an hour reading Arabic or Persian, and what that means is that you're going to be able to read 5 pages of something, you probably want to read 5 pages of a primary text, right? Whereas, you know, a native speaker could read 30 pages of a secondary text. So I think that there's obvious pragmatic problems there. I'm actually, I mean, one thing I think would be worth saying about this is that it's not a unique situation. So if you think about a comparable case, which is, do scholars of ancient philosophy read modern Greek literature about Plato and Aristotle? The answer is definitely and emphatically no, they do not. Now, obviously, there's a difference there because modern Greek is not the same as ancient Greek. But notice that, I mean, that just makes the point that scholars of ancient philosophy are never told that they need to go read modern Greek. I mean, or learn modern Greek, they might, but it would kind of be an optional thing to do. And in fact, I'm not even sure that scholars who work on, let's say, Kant and Hegel are that up to speed on what's happening in German language secondary literature on Kant and Hegel. Probably the more dutiful ones are. But I think a lot of people who publish on Kant and Hegel, they read German kind of the way I read Arabic, like a little bit slowly. And, you know, again, they're going to say, well, if I'm going to read some German, I'd rather read Kant, right? So I think it's not a unique situation, but that doesn't make it any better. I mean, it just means it's a lamentable situation, which is more widespread. And I think that apart from the kind of obvious practical problems that are standing in the way of fixing it, I think there's a broader issue, which is just the general fact that non-Western university academic systems are not in contact with the academic system in the United States and Europe for the most part. So, you know, people are always going back and forth between, let's say, Berkeley and the LMU or Oxford and Harvard, but they're not going back and forth between Tehran and Harvard, right? And there's all kinds of reasons for that. There's language barriers, there's political barriers, you know, there's difficulties getting visas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the problem is deeper than just people being too lazy to go read secondary literature in Persian and Arabic. I think, to be honest, this is just like one of an infinite number of manifestations of an unfair geopolitical situation where some languages have more clout and power than others. And of course, English has the most clout and the most power. And so you can kind of get away with living your whole academic world within English in a way that you could never get away with doing that even in Italian, let's say. So I think that's the way it is. And given that scholars can get away with it, the question is, should they get away with it, or should they try to do better? And so this is actually something that I've tried to do a little bit better, at least in the last few years. So, for example, when I was writing this book on Razi, you helped me by giving me advice on some of the Persian language literature on Razi. And although it's not like I'm citing Persian language literature on every page, I do cite Persian language secondary literature about Razi in the book, and I think the book is better for it. Now, I needed help from you to do that, but at least I asked someone who could help me. And so I think this is sort of like what I was saying about collaboration before. If you know your limitations, then you can at least go find someone who's more on top of literature in these languages than you are to find out what would be worth reading. If you're not good enough in the language to actually read it, at least maybe find someone who has read it who can tell you what's in there, so you can go to the right part. So I think everyone could do better in this respect.
Yeah. So given your background knowledge of the current situation of the Persian scholarship on falsafa, I wonder what would you consider as the most important contribution of the Persian community to the global community, and also connected to it, Of course, we can also answer it separately. But what do you think that the European scholarship needs to learn from Persian-speaking academia working on falsafa? Of course, I mean with academia, I mean people who work on falsafa. And what should the Persian-speaking academia learn from like European or global academia in this field?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so there's an obvious thing that people in Iran have done, and also in other Islamic countries, which is create editions of classical works and post-classical works. So we should probably give more credit than is usually done for that, right? Because that's a lot of work and it's not easy, and you have to understand what you're reading, right, to edit a text. So, I mean, I think a lot of European scholars, you sort of hear them complaining about the standards of editions in Arabic and Persian, to which my answer would be, well, then you go do a better one, right? So I think, first of all, we should really acknowledge that everything we're doing actually is built on work that was done by editors in these countries. But then in addition to that, I think in a way, Iranian language scholarship already gave a huge benefit to European language scholarship. And this goes back to what we were talking about before, namely the fact that we now take post-classical philosophy more seriously. So if you think about the history of that idea of taking post-classical philosophy more seriously, it really came into English through Iranian scholars, people like Sayyid Hossein Nasr, who said, well, we have this whole completely different way of thinking about the history of philosophy. So we don't look at it backwards from Aquinas, we look at it backwards from Mulla Sadra. And when we do that, we get this very different story. We have Ibn Sina, followed by Sohrawardi, the school of Shiraz, Mulla Sadra, right, arguing with Mir Damad. So completely different, and it was almost like there were two different fields for a while there, namely the kind of Greek into Arabic into Latin field of scholarship, and the Ibn Sina up to Mulla Sadra field of scholarship. And they weren't really talking to each other. But I think what's happened in the last 20 years, so I would say since the time I got my PhD, is that there's been a real effort by people in the traditional way of thinking to take over the insights from that approach. So it's less kind of filtered through Mulla Sadra, I think, than it was in the work of someone like Nasser. But it at least says, oh, no, he was right about something here. Like there is this really interesting later tradition that we should be paying attention to. And that's become integrated into this formerly very kind of Eurocentric way of studying philosophy in the Islamic world. So basically the question is like, are you studying texts that never were translated into Latin? And if you are, then in some way you're benefiting from the insights of the Iranian scholarly community, because they were the ones who pushed successfully for that to be integrated into European language scholarship. I mean, as for what could be learned from each other now, I think probably there's a lot more understanding of post-classical philosophy still in Persia than in European scholarship. So like if you want to, like there have been people working in Fakhreddin Razi in Iran for a lot longer than there have been in Europe for the most part. And again, you know, it would be good if European scholars took more from that scholarship.
And what the Iranian academia could learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of, I think I would be humble enough to say I don't know the answer. I mean, like, obviously we could, you know, you could say something like, well, maybe they should be abandoning that Mulla Sadra centric way of seeing the history. But I don't think that it's not like everyone who works on philosophy in Iran sees it in that way. And I think the people who do see it that way probably have considered other options and rejected them at this point. And so it's not like if the Europeans came along and said, oh no, don't you realize that there's another way of seeing it? I mean, maybe one thing though would be, I think one increasing tendency in European language philosophy is to take the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire seriously. And that's like an easy thing to do from the Iranian point of view, to take the Mughal Empire seriously because it's Persian. But I think that the Sunni Shiite cultural divide there is not helpful for the history of philosophy. So insofar as that's still a thing that is in some way conditioning work on history of philosophy in Iran, And I wouldn't want to say that it is across the board, but insofar as it is, I think, you know, taking account of the Ottoman or even like African Islamic philosophy as part of the story would be a good thing to do for everybody.
Thank you very much. So my last question would have a very short answer. Actually, it's kind of fun. So I was wondering, I mean, it's also kind of personalized, more personalized even than the previous question. So regarding your own areas of expertise, which publications or which author has kind of like revolutionized, let's say, the field for you or the subject for you? I mean, of course, you can name people from, I mean, I'm working on the field of ancient Greek philosophy or late ancient Greek philosophy, falsafa, and of course, Latin philosophy, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a couple of things from the Greek philosophy. There's an article by Miles Bernier called Aristotle on Understanding Knowledge. And I would say I've published at least 10 things that in some way came out of my reading that article, because, I mean, it's kind of complicated, but basically he says Aristotle's understanding of knowledge is not what we think knowledge is. It's something much, much more ambitious and demanding. And I really took a lot from that and applied that insight to, I mean, a lot of the stuff I published on Ibn Sina and other figures is just applying that insight to them, that Bernier made in for Aristotle. Another person I would mention here is Sarah Brody, whose work on like necessity and modality in Aristotle also is something that I really took a lot from and applied to the study of philosophy in the Islamic world. As far as philosophy in the Islamic world goes, I mean, this doesn't happen very often, but there's a book where I can literally, this is a book of secondary literature that I can literally remember where I was when I read it. I was on a train in Germany reading Dimitri Gutas's Avicenna and the Aristotelian tradition. And I remember it was sort of something I was a grad student, and it was something I'd kind of been meaning to get around to reading because everyone said it was important, but it seemed quite demanding, you know, it's like very detailed. And so I read it and I was just stunned. And I thought, oh, that's what we're trying to do. Like that, and it goes back to what we were saying before, like the combination of philology with philosophical analysis. I just thought that he had set the bar so high there that this was like, that's what I want to do. I want to do that kind of work for the authors that I'm interested in. And so that really also had a big impact on me. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say I've managed to do that, and I wouldn't compare myself to Gutas. Like, we have differences of opinion about, in fact, some of the things we've discussed just now. He doesn't agree with me about all of them. And I guess my approach is probably more oriented towards a philosophical audience, and his approach is a little bit more oriented towards a philological audience. But nonetheless, I thought that was like a real model to follow. So there's three at least, but that, obviously there are more.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks,
thank
Hanif.
you for your time, and thanks the audience for watching this video later.
Yeah, thanks for sticking with us.
Bye bye.